Hey, sister, welcome back to the Your Sorority Journey podcast. We are in our Step Up series, giving you guidance on all things officer elections and transitions. In this really transitional time for leadership, it is so easy to get overwhelmed by the pressure you feel as an aspiring or outgoing leader, to get caught up in the culture of competition, running for positions in your chapter or community. And so today I wanted to talk about something that is really important to me called trusting your sisters, ensuring that you are of the belief, you are of the mindset that the chapter always makes the right decision. Now, if you've listened to episode 70, you know that I've had my fair share of celebratory elections and disappointing elections. When I was going through my first couple elections process as a new initiate and a sophomore member, I felt like I was on this high after elections. I wasn't even on the slate for my first elections and got nominated off the floor and won Panhellenic delegate. The next year, I was elected chapter president. And so when the next year came around, I had put in all this time, all this energy into the chapter and the community at large. Not to have been elected into any of the Panhellenic executive board roles felt humiliating. I was not in a good place and was definitely of the opinion that some hardship had been done to me, right? That the best interest of Cassie were not in mind in those deliberations in slating or in nomination committee or by the delegates at large. And I think I wish that I had known, or I wish that I had remembered that the chapter or the community always makes the right decision. This is so much less about you as an individual. This was so much less about Cassie as an individual than it is about the best interests of the chapter or the community at large. You see, I look back and I see that the decisions that were made to put individuals in the positions that they were elected into was intentional, right? And it ended up happening that I found my place on the executive board a few weeks later, but in those in-between weeks, I felt like something had been done against me, that my best interests were not viewed. And if you're feeling that way after elections, I'm really glad that you are listening to this episode and we can have a conversation about believing and truly stepping into the truth that the chapter always makes the right decision. That phrase was first shared with me after my first election. A senior member of the chapter, I'll never forget it. I hopped in her car after elections and I knew the other sister who hadn't been elected into the position that I was just elected into. She'd been slated, was disappointed and maybe a little upset with me even. And I remember commenting on this to this older member who I was in the car with. And she said, Cassie, I totally understand, but you have to remember that the chapter always makes the right decision. And in this case, they chose to elect you into the role of Panhellenic delegate. Now, sometimes that goes the opposite direction, right? Like my senior year or my junior to senior year when I wasn't elected, believing that the community at that time had made the right decision was hard to stomach. But the reason we have to get on board with this concept that the chapter always makes the right decision is because we are membership-based organizations. If you go back to recruitment and you remember going through those rounds and getting to bid day, there was an invitation extended to you to join that chapter based on shared values, common interests, and like-minded nature of what you wanted to accomplish in sisterhood, right? That doesn't mean you were going to like all the exact same things as the other women. It didn't mean that you weren't unique. You didn't bring a valuable skill set that was different than other sisters, right? This doesn't mean that you were cookie cutter to every other sister in that chapter, but it meant that there was enough of a common basis that you could get on board with the initiatives and the direction that the chapter was going. Maybe there'd be some disagreements in the ways that we took to get to that long-term vision, but the end goal that you had of your sorority membership and the chapter had of the purpose of their membership aligned. And now you made those decisions probably in this last recruitment. You made those decisions to extend invitations to future sisters who shared those values, those beliefs, and that vision for your organization. Now, with that, it's important to remember that in an invite-only ultimately an exclusive organization, you should be agreeing with the direction that at least 50% of your chapter is wanting to go, right? And so when it comes down to elections, this is really important when we talk about elections, because when you are voting on candidate A versus candidate B, Alexa or Ashley, whoever it is who's running for chapter president in your chapter, it is so important to remember that your sisters are voting in the best interest of the chapter at large. And if your ideal candidate, if you get elected into that role or the other candidate, you have to sit with knowing that the chapter always makes the right decision. That was what the majority of the chapter believed was the best next step to get the chapter, to get the organization, to get the community in the direction that they all wanted to go and grow. And so sometimes the outcome of the chapter making the best decision isn't the outcome that we wanted. It can be taken really personally. It can feel like a popularity contest, right? And so I want to give you 3 ways that you can press into trusting your sisters through this process and really seeing your sisterhood and your sense of community strengthened through elections instead of broken apart. And the first one, I believe, is taking the time, creating the space for you to process the outcome of elections. Now, everyone is different. We all need a different amount of time or space. So for you, that might be after your position is voted on through the end of elections, right? Typically that happens in a more ritual style meeting. So it's probably pretty quiet. You aren't chatting with your friends. You have some quiet time to process. You also might need that evening after elections and the rest of the week to really sit down and think, okay, the outcome of elections have these implications on me. I was elected into my ideal role. I feel good about myself. I was elected into a role that I didn't expect. I am confused. I don't know what to make of this. Or I wasn't elected into a role at all. What is it going to look like for me to be a titleless leader, right? There are pros and cons of every outcome that happens for you in elections. Sitting down with yourself to work through those is important. It's also important for you to consider the pros and cons and the repercussions for your other sisters, right? You probably have close friends or will have close friends who aren't elected into their ideal role. So how can you think through for them? This might be a pro for her. This might be a con for her. How about the sister who gets elected into the role you wanted? What are the pros for her? What are the cons for her? Thinking through the outcome of elections on all fronts helps us take the focus off you and look more holistically at the chapter. After you have process the outcome of elections, I want you to remember your why. That's number 2, is go back to your why that we talked about in our first episode of the Step Up series. I want you to move away from, yes, I just won this popularity contest, or they didn't like me, I didn't win. Move it away from that to looking at that impact you wanted to create, right? The whole point of the first episode of this series was removing position titles or specific job responsibilities from the impact that you wanted to have in the chapter. And so when you are able to go back to that impact and insert that in to the position you have, if you're new member educator and wanted to create a stronger sense of sisterhood in the chapter, or you weren't elected into anything, and you're trying to figure out how to create a stronger sense of sisterhood without a title, you have to take the time to look at how you're going to live out your why with a little bit more clarity around the position or lack thereof that you are working with, right? If you are in that position, you have a council that you're working with, right? Your impact has to fit into the greater vision of what all the other officers want to do. If you don't have a role, you have to find a way to get on those right committees or take that personal initiative to accomplish what it is that you want to, the impact that you desire for the chapter. And so knowing your why and inserting that in to the opportunity that you have for the upcoming year takes us to number 3. After you have processed the outcome, known and remembered your why, it's time to congratulate your sisters. It's time to congratulate the sister who got elected into the role that you wanted. It's time to congratulate the sister who isn't your favorite and just got elected chapter president, or who you didn't vote on, but now is in a position of influence. It's also time for you to reach out to the sisters who you know really well, or those that you watched go through the elections process and not get elected into roles that they ran for, to ask them how they're doing, to check in on how you can support them, maybe send them this podcast episode and have them go through this same process. You never know how things are going to shake out next year, right? You never know, depending on how much more time you have in the chapter, what this next officer term is going to look like, where you might be for elections next year. And so the way that you process this with grace and understanding and true trust in your sisters can actually strengthen your sisterhood in a competitive time that has the opportunity to break it apart. You have a decision to make, sister, whether you want to be self-righteous and selfish and really introspective like I was. And that's okay for a point, right? It's okay to take some time. Like, that's why we give you the space to process and work through the outcome of elections. But I really want to challenge you not to stay there, not to take this personally, and look at the chapter holistically, where it's going and how you can be a part of that, because you never know where you might be next year and what opportunities might present itself based on the way you process the outcome of elections gracefully, and trust your sisters in the process.